What begins as a utopian dream in the remote Canadian wilderness soon spirals into a nightmare of unimaginable cruelty. A story that sounds almost too horrifying to be true, but is, tragically, all too real. This is the chilling tale of the Anthill Kids, a commune led by a man who promised salvation but delivered terror. His name was Robert Gauthier, a figure who captivated the desperate and the vulnerable, convincing them to leave behind their lives, their families, and even their identities, all to follow him into the unknown. In the beginning, it seemed like a dream, a place where people could shed the burdens of modern life, reconnect with nature, and live in harmony. A self-sufficient community, far from the chaos of the outside world, where every need was met, and every soul found purpose. It was an idea so alluring, so compelling, that it pulled people in like moths to a flame. Gauthier had the charisma of a prophet. He spoke with confidence, conviction, and a warmth that made people believe he truly cared about them. He promised a better life, a life free from sin, full of meaning, and blessed by divine favor. But what happens when trust in a leader turns into blind obedience? When the man you see as a savior begins to wield his influence not as a guide, but as a weapon? When your sanctuary becomes your prison, and your protector becomes your tormentor? Tonight, we're diving deep into this harrowing story. The rise and fall of a commune that began with hope but ended in horror. This is the story of the Anthill Kids. Turn the lights down low, sit back, and prepare yourself, because the darkness in this tale is all too real. Welcome to Eerie Road Tales, where we reveal the darkest and most chilling stories from the shadows of history around the world. If you're drawn to true horror that lingers long after the lights go out, you're in the right place. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let's begin. Robert Gauthier's vision was nothing short of divine, or so he claimed. He wasn't just an ordinary man with a dream. He was a self-proclaimed prophet, a vessel chosen to guide the lost and the weary toward salvation. His words carried a weight that few could resist. For those who felt adrift in the chaos of modern life, his promises offered something tantalizing: purpose. He spoke of a community unlike any other, a place where faith and hard work would converge to create a utopia, a new Eden. To hear him speak was mesmerizing. He would paint vivid pictures of what life could be, a simple existence free from the sins of the outside world. He described rolling fields, fresh air, and the sound of nature filling their days instead of the noise and corruption of the cities. He told his followers that they were chosen, a select group of individuals destined to create a society that others would envy, a society that would stand as a beacon of purity and righteousness. And many believed him. How could they not? His charisma was overpowering, his words dripping with conviction. It wasn't long before the first of his followers abandoned their former lives to join him. They left behind homes, jobs, families, all to follow Gauthier into the wilderness of Quebec. This remote location, far from the prying eyes of society, became the foundation of his dream. For those who arrived, it was like stepping into another world. Towering trees surrounded them, and the air was so crisp it felt cleansing, as if they were already shedding the burdens of their old lives. In those early days, the commune had a magic to it. People worked side by side, building cabins from scratch and planting gardens that would soon feed the entire group. There was a rhythm to their days, a harmony that felt almost sacred. Gauthier would lead them in prayers, speaking of their divine mission and filling their hearts with a sense of pride and purpose. He referred to them as his children, his family, and for many, this was the first time they truly felt they belonged somewhere. But even in paradise, shadows can creep in. Gauthier's leadership, while inspiring, came with an intensity that some found unsettling. He insisted on total commitment, mind, body, and soul. At first, it seemed reasonable. After all, a community like this required discipline to survive. But his rules became increasingly strict. Mealtimes were carefully orchestrated, with Gauthier deciding who ate what and when. Work was no longer shared equally. Instead, it was doled out based on who he deemed most worthy. And then there were the punishments. They started small, public scoldings for minor mistakes. A late arrival to a task might earn a sharp rebuke in front of the group. But over time, the reprimands grew harsher. Those who questioned his decisions were forced to kneel for hours in prayer, asking for forgiveness. Those who failed to meet his expectations were denied food or made to sleep outside in the cold. Despite this, Gauthier's charisma remained unshaken. When he spoke of their mission, his eyes burned with a fervor that reignited their faith. He told them that their suffering was necessary, a purification process that would bring them closer to God. And his followers, desperate to believe, convinced themselves that he was right. The isolation of the Commune only strengthened Gauthier's control. Without access to the outside world, his followers had no one to turn to but him. He became their source of truth, their provider, their judge. Every decision, every action was filtered through him. And as his grip tightened, the cracks in his vision began to widen. Some noticed the way he watched them, his eyes scanning for any hint of dissent. Others whispered about the increasing severity of his punishments. But no one dared speak openly. To question Gauthier was to risk everything: their place in the Commune, their connection to the group, their very survival. For now, most still believed in his dream. They told themselves that the discomfort was temporary, that the hardships they endured would lead to something beautiful. But beneath the surface of their carefully constructed paradise, the seeds of horror were already being planted. Gauthier's vision was no longer a dream of unity. It was becoming a nightmare of control. And soon, those seeds would begin to sprout. The shift was subtle at first, almost imperceptible to those living under Robert Gauthier's rule. In the early days, his leadership had felt like a guiding hand, steady and purposeful. He spoke of love, of unity, of the sacrifices they all had to make to build something sacred. But as time passed, his words began to take on a different tone, one that carried the weight of expectation, the sting of disappointment, and the looming threat of consequence. The first punishment came almost without warning. A young woman, barely more than a girl, had failed to wake at the exact moment Gauthier had decreed. Perhaps she had overslept by minutes, maybe seconds, but that was enough. He summoned the group, his voice calm, measured, but brimming with unspoken menace. He stood before them, his figure towering in the dim light, and explained that her failure was not just a lapse in discipline but a betrayal of their mission. He ordered her to kneel, her head bowed, as he lectured the others about the dangers of complacency. Then, in front of everyone, he struck her. The slap was loud, reverberating through the clearing, silencing even the birds in the trees. She didn't cry out. Perhaps she was too stunned, or maybe she understood the consequences of showing resistance. Instead, she stayed on her knees, trembling but silent, as Gauthier continued to berate her. For the others, it was a shocking moment, a sudden, jarring departure from the man they had trusted with their lives. But Gauthier quickly regained control of the narrative. He told them that discipline was necessary, that their mission was too important to allow even the smallest infraction. He framed the punishment not as cruelty but as love, a necessary correction to keep them on the righteous path. And slowly, his followers began to rationalize what they had seen. This was how it began. Small acts of violence, always justified by a greater purpose. A slap here, a night spent outside in the cold there. Each punishment was framed as an act of care, a lesson meant to bring them closer to the purity they were striving for. Gauthier wielded his power with precision, never pushing too far, always keeping just enough trust intact to keep his followers in line. But over time, the punishments grew harsher. One evening, a man was caught whispering to another during one of Gauthier's long sermons. The offense was minor. Perhaps he was only commenting on the chill in the air or the flicker of the firelight. But Gauthier seized the moment. He demanded the man stand before the group and confess his sins. When the man hesitated, Gauthier's demeanor shifted. His voice, once soothing and fatherly, became cold and sharp. He dragged the man to the center of the group and struck him repeatedly, each blow more vicious than the last. By the time it was over, the man was left battered and broken, physically and emotionally. He was forced to thank Gauthier for his correction, to acknowledge that his punishment was deserved. And the others watched, horrified but silent, too afraid to intervene. It was in moments like these that Gauthier's true genius for manipulation became clear. He didn't just punish. He turned the act into a spectacle, a ritual that reinforced his authority and isolated his followers from one another. They were too afraid to speak out, too fearful of becoming the next target. And so, they turned inward, burying their doubts and clinging even more tightly to the belief that Gauthier was their savior. He used their fear to tighten his grip, but he didn't stop there. He began to rewrite their reality, convincing them that the outside world was filled with sin and corruption. He told them that their families, their friends, anyone they had left behind, were lost causes, consumed by darkness. He painted a picture of a hostile, unforgiving world that would never accept them, a world where they would be hunted and persecuted if they ever tried to leave. His sermons became darker, more apocalyptic. He warned of punishments far greater than anything he could deliver, divine retribution that would rain down upon those who strayed from the path. He made himself the gatekeeper of salvation, the only one who could protect them from the horrors of the world beyond the commune. And yet, there must have been moments of doubt. Silent, fleeting moments when his followers questioned what they were enduring. But what could they do? Leaving wasn't an option. Where would they go? Who would believe them? The man they had trusted most, the man who had promised to lead them to paradise, had become their tormentor. What would you do if the person you trusted most turned on you, and every escape route was blocked? Think about that as we continue. Take a moment to subscribe to Eerie Road Tales. Hit that subscribe button, and let's continue the story. The punishments began to take on a life of their own, escalating from mere corrections into spectacles of domination. What had started as slaps and scoldings transformed into something far more sinister. Gauthier's punishments became rituals, each one crafted to break not just the body but the spirit. He used lashings to make an example of those who faltered, whipping them in front of the others, their cries of pain echoing through the forest. The lash was his way of asserting control, a physical reminder that defiance would not be tolerated. The workdays grew longer and harsher. Gauthier demanded more from his followers, pushing them past the limits of their endurance. Hours of backbreaking labor in the sun, constructing new buildings or tending to the gardens, became the norm. If anyone slowed down or showed signs of fatigue, they would be singled out for punishment. Sometimes it was the lash. Other times, it was worse. One particularly cruel punishment involved forcing a man to carry an enormous boulder up a hill, a task so grueling it seemed impossible. As the man stumbled and fell, Gauthier stood over him, yelling that his failure was a sign of weakness, a betrayal of their mission. The others were ordered to watch, their silence complicit. The man, bruised and exhausted, eventually collapsed, unable to continue. Gauthier left him lying there as a warning to the others, a reminder that mercy was a luxury they could not expect. The psychological torment was just as brutal. Gauthier began to turn his followers against one another, planting seeds of distrust and paranoia. He would accuse someone of disloyalty with no evidence, forcing them to confess sins they hadn't committed. These confessions were extracted publicly, with the accused often forced to kneel and beg for forgiveness. Gauthier used these moments to humiliate and degrade, stripping his followers of their dignity. In one of the most harrowing acts, a mother was accused of failing to properly discipline her child. Gauthier made her stand in front of the group while he berated her, calling her an unfit parent and a disgrace to their mission. Then, in a horrifying twist, he ordered the child to strike his own mother as punishment. The boy, no older than 6 or 7, was too terrified to refuse. The sight of the boy's trembling hands and the mother's silent tears haunted those who witnessed it, but none dared speak out. These acts of cruelty served a purpose. They weren't just punishments, they were tools of control. By breaking his followers physically and emotionally, Gauthier ensured their dependence on him. He positioned himself as both the source of their suffering and the only one who could offer them redemption. But even under his oppressive rule, cracks began to form. The punishments were becoming too severe, too frequent. Whispers of dissent began to circulate among the group. Quiet conversations held in the dead of night, far from Gauthier's ears. The turning point came when one of his punishments crossed a line that even his most loyal followers could not ignore. A young woman named Ali had been accused of stealing food. Gauthier decided to make an example of her in a way that would leave an indelible mark on the group. He tied her to a tree and lashed her until her back was raw and bleeding, ignoring her cries for mercy. Then, he ordered her to be left tied up overnight, exposed to the freezing temperatures. When morning came, Ali was barely conscious, her body trembling with cold and pain. The sight of her broken figure shook the group to its core. For many, this was the moment their faith in Gauthier began to waver. How could a man who claimed to be their savior inflict such suffering? How could someone who preached love and unity be capable of such cruelty? The whispers grew louder. Some began to question whether Gauthier was truly the prophet he claimed to be. Others started to think about escape, though the idea seemed impossible. They were isolated, watched constantly, and terrified of what might happen if they were caught. But even as doubt spread, Gauthier tightened his grip. He became more paranoid, more controlling. He accused the group of conspiring against him, warning that betrayal would bring divine punishment. The atmosphere in the commune became suffocating, the tension unbearable. And yet, beneath the surface, a rebellion was brewing. The seeds of resistance had been planted, watered by the blood and tears of those who had suffered under Gauthier's rule. The cracks in the commune were growing wider, and it was only a matter of time before something, or someone, broke free. As Gauthier's grip tightened, cracks in the commune began to form, leading to a rebellion that no one could have predicted. The rebellion started quietly, like a ripple in a still pond. It wasn't an open revolt at first. No sudden uprising, no group of warriors rushing to fight Gauthier and his reign of terror. It began with small acts of defiance. Tiny, imperceptible attempts at reaching out to the world beyond the Commune, the world that had become nothing more than a distant memory to those trapped in Gauthier's clutches. The fear of retribution hung heavy in the air, thick enough to choke anyone brave enough to try. Every day, the risk of punishment grew greater, but so did the desperation. The survivors of the Ant Hill Kids commune had nothing left to lose. One of the first to try was Michel, a former believer in Gauthier's vision, who had watched everything crumble around him. The bodies of the broken minds of his fellow members, and the slow erosion of his own spirit. What had once seemed like a sanctuary had become a prison, where Gauthier's tyranny was unchallenged, where fear was the currency and punishment was the price of every mistake. The isolation gnawed at Michel, wearing him down to the bone. He knew what would happen if he failed, if Gauthier caught him. There would be no mercy. But even in the darkest of places, there are moments of light. Michel had seen an opportunity, a fleeting chance. One evening, when the guards were distracted by their own tasks, he quietly crept away from the main camp, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold air bit at his skin as he moved through the trees, careful to avoid the path that might lead back to the commune. He had no plan, no real direction, just a burning need to escape, to make it to civilization, to reach someone, anyone, who could hear his cries for help. As he made his way down the rough trail, the ground underfoot felt like a trap, every step potentially fatal. He could already imagine Gauthier's reaction when he discovered Michel was gone. Rage, the kind that burned through everything in its path. The man who had once been a father figure, a godlike leader in the eyes of so many, would no longer be that figure of safety and warmth. In fact, he would become a monster to be feared. But Michel couldn't think of that now. He had to keep moving. Finally, after hours of stumbling through the wilderness, he saw it, an old truck on a nearby road, its engine idling. A trucker. A moment of fate. Without thinking, Michel ran toward the truck, nearly tripping over his own feet in his desperation. He reached the driver and begged for help. At first, the trucker hesitated, looking at him as though he had just encountered a ghost. He was ragged, covered in dirt, and wild-eyed. But the desperation in his voice was undeniable. "Please," Michel pleaded, "I need to get out of here. I'm from a commune. They're abusing us. You have to help." The trucker paused, then nodded, realizing the weight of what was happening. "I'll call the cops," he said, his voice low, with an understanding that went beyond mere words. He didn't know the full story, but he knew enough to understand that this wasn't just a man lost in the woods. This was someone desperate to escape. Within minutes, the authorities were contacted, and backup arrived. Michel, with the last shred of his strength, led the officers back toward the commune, to where Gauthier and his followers were still trapped in their isolation, unaware that the walls were beginning to crack. They didn't know yet that their world was about to collapse, but the first domino had already fallen. Back at the commune, the word spread like wildfire. Gauthier, still reeling from Michel's escape, was unaware of the ripple effect that had been set into motion. He believed that his power was still absolute, that no one would dare to betray him. But he didn't understand the lengths to which his followers would go to escape him. Some had nothing left to lose, some had already given everything, and the time had come for them to act. The real turning point, however, came when Claire, a quiet and unassuming young woman, found the courage to act. For months, She had endured the horrors of the Commune. She had seen the brutality, the bloodshed, the endless fear that seemed to gnaw at the hearts of every person there. She had witnessed Gauthier's increasing paranoia, the tightening of his control. She had been just another face in the crowd, another follower, another victim, until one night, when she couldn't bear it any longer. She had to act. In the dead of night, Claire sneaked away from the sleeping quarters, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. The plan was simple: find a way to contact the outside world. She knew the risks. Gauthier's punishment for even the slightest transgression would be brutal, but her resolve had hardened. The faces of the men and women around her, hollow-eyed and broken, haunted her every waking moment. They all needed help, and Claire would not allow them to perish in this nightmare. She moved swiftly through the trees, avoiding the guards and making her way to the small clearing where a rarely used path led to the outer world. She was sure she could make it. She had to. Just as she neared the edge of the forest, a guard appeared. Claire froze, her heart in her throat. They locked eyes. For a moment, neither moved. It seemed like time had frozen, but then the guard, recognizing her face, called out, just as the sound of footsteps behind her grew louder. Her heart pounded in her chest as she dashed through the trees, stumbling, her breath ragged in the cold air. She ran with everything she had left in her, her legs burning, but her resolve steeled by the thought of escape. By sheer luck, she managed to slip through the outer fence, and when she emerged into the open road, a car appeared, its headlights cutting through the night like a beacon. A miracle. She flagged it down, her body trembling with exhaustion, relief, and terror all at once. This wasn't just her escape, it was the salvation of everyone trapped in that hell. The driver was a local, and when Claire told her story, the woman was horrified. She immediately contacted the authorities. This was it, the moment the Commune's downfall began. Within hours, law enforcement had mobilized. The response was swift, but the scale of the rescue operation was immense. Police surrounded the Commune and began to storm it. Gauthier, now fully aware of what was happening, attempted to rally his followers, demanding their loyalty, urging them to fight back. He attempted to make one last stand, but the sheer force of the law and the intervention of authorities shattered his hold over the Commune. The police rushed in, freeing the survivors and arresting Gauthier. But even in defeat, Gauthier's influence lingered. The survivors, exhausted, bruised, and broken, were taken to safety, but the trauma they had endured was not so easily erased. The psychological scars would remain long after the physical ones had healed. They had escaped, but the horrors they had lived through would follow them into the rest of their lives. Reflecting on the courage it took for those who resisted, the question remains: how could they summon the strength to fight back after all they had endured? To resist Gauthier, to defy the very man who had once been their savior, required a bravery that most could only dream of. To escape the nightmare took not just physical courage, but the courage to stand up to the very person who had instilled such deep fear. The survivors who managed to break free, the ones who risked it all to save themselves and their fellow members, are a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even in the darkest, most suffocating circumstances. As they walked away from that nightmare, they carried with them the reminder that sometimes it is the most broken among us who find the courage to escape the deepest hells. And though their journey had been long and painful, their courage will never be forgotten. The Ant Hill Kids Commune, once a place where hope and dreams of peace and self-sufficiency flourished, had morphed into a waking nightmare. What had started as a utopian vision, an idealized retreat from the chaos of the modern world, became a horror story that no one could have predicted. In those early days, Robert Gauthier's promises were powerful. He offered freedom from societal constraints, the chance to live in harmony with the earth, and the allure of a life without the corruption of modern civilization. It seemed like the perfect escape. But as time wore on, the veneer of paradise cracked, revealing the twisted, tyrannical regime that lurked beneath. Gauthier, once a man of charisma and conviction, turned into a ruthless dictator who thrived on control, manipulation, and fear. The transformation was gradual at first, almost imperceptible. His demands started small. Tiny rules, little rituals meant to create a sense of unity and purpose. But over time, these small gestures morphed into something much darker. What began as the enforcement of daily routines became a system of oppressive control, suffocating every trace of individuality. His punishments grew increasingly brutal, and his once charismatic leadership evolved into something far more sinister. An authoritarian nightmare where disobedience was met with violence and dissent was crushed without mercy. What was supposed to be a peaceful, self-sustaining commune became a prison in the middle of the wilderness, its members trapped not only by the physical boundaries of their isolation but by the overwhelming grip of Gauthier's psychological and emotional manipulation. There were those who tried to escape, tried to reach out for help, but every attempt was met with punishment, sometimes severe, often fatal. The fear that permeated every corner of the commune was palpable. It was a place where a wrong word could cost someone their life, and where escape seemed impossible, as if the walls of fear and isolation were simply too high to climb. But even in the darkest of places, there is always the spark of rebellion, the glimmer of hope that someone will fight for freedom. And, after years of suffering, that moment finally arrived. When the survivors reached the outside world, when they found that one person who would listen, the fate of the commune was sealed. The authorities, alerted to the horrors within, descended upon the commune. They tore through the compound, breaking down the doors of Gauthier's tyrannical reign. And though the survivors were freed, the damage had already been done. The scars, both physical and mental, would never fade. The commune had been destroyed, its legacy forever marked by the suffering it had caused. As for Robert Gauthier, he was arrested and charged for his crimes. His actions, the physical, emotional, and psychological abuse he had inflicted on his followers, could not be undone. He was sentenced to prison, but no sentence could ever truly make up for the suffering he had caused. The survivors, though free from Gauthier's clutches, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, haunted by the horrors they had witnessed, the friends and family members they had lost, and the years they had spent in that hellish paradise. The story of the Ant Hill Kids is a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority. It shows us how a leader, once trusted, once revered, can spiral into madness when given too much power, too much control. Gauthier's descent from a charismatic leader to a ruthless dictator is a tragic example of how blind obedience can lead to unimaginable horror. It serves as a chilling warning of how easily a utopian vision can be twisted into a dystopian nightmare when individuals surrender their autonomy and their ability to think for themselves. And perhaps, most importantly, it teaches us about the human spirit's incredible resilience. In the face of unimaginable abuse, in the depths of despair, there were those who found the courage to resist, to escape, and to stand up for themselves and their fellow survivors. Their bravery, their refusal to accept the status quo, their desire to break free from the nightmare they had been trapped in. This is the true story of the Ant Hill Kids. If you're watching this now, I want you to think about that. What would you do if the person you trusted the most turned into your greatest tormentor? What lengths would you go to in order to break free from a situation that seemed impossible to escape? These questions aren't easy, but they are vital. And they are part of why we need to remember stories like this, so we don't forget the lessons they carry. I want to hear from you. What do you think about the horrors that unfolded at the Ant Hill Kids commune? Have you heard of any other chilling real-life stories that send shivers down your spine? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what other true horror tales you'd like to hear. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, so you never miss an eerie story like this. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and remember, there are far darker places in the world than we might ever imagine. Thank you for joining us on this dark journey into one of history's most terrifying cults. If you found this story as chilling as we did, be sure to subscribe to Eerie Road Tales for more true horror stories that will keep you up at night. We dive deep into the darkest corners of human history, uncovering the terrifying truths that lurk beneath the surface. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to hit that like button and leave your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what you think, or share any other unsettling stories you'd like to hear. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the truth is far scarier than fiction.